Ben Appel, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Can you tell me what it was like growing up in a fundamentalist Christian community?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the quick and first answer to that is that it was like really delightful. I, you know, lived in kind of a bubble. It was called a covenant community in Maryland, just outside of Baltimore. And all the families lived in the same neighborhood. It wasn't like a commune, but we all populated the same, couple square miles of a neighborhood. And so many of my neighbors were other people in the community. And my friends, I had known since infancy or shortly after that. And, we went to this tiny school together. And, it was a very tight-knit clan. My parents were together still. I had three siblings. We had a good life. I didn't know anything different. And so it was a good life. A lot of times the real kind of trauma or difficulty doesn't come until after you leave a community like that and you experience what it's like to be kind of excommunicated or shunned from that community and to feel completely cut off and alienated. But then also, when you're indoctrinated with a lot of dogma that doesn't necessarily, make you well prepared for living in the real world, especially if you end up being different, if you end up being gay like I am. So a lot of the things that I was programmed to believe kind of came back and bit me a little bit later on.
So it's like, I'm surprised by the way you're describing it. Like it felt like a loving community. Like usually I see fundamentalism as a bad thing, but I suppose you didn't realize you were gay at the time. So perhaps it wasn't. When did you start to come out? When did you leave the cult? And then when did you realize you were gay?
Yeah. So it was and that was the tough time because we left when I was 12. So I finished my sixth grade. It was a school. The school was from kindergarten to eighth grade. And we left the summer after my sixth grade year. And I was 12 years old. And coincidentally or, simultaneously at that time, some kids at the local swimming pool, which was a public pool that a lot of us belonged to, started making fun of me and calling me gay. And I was always really effeminate, growing up. I was always really girly kid, but in the community, there wasn't really an in crowd and it was so taboo to even talk about sexuality. And we were all just like, good Christian soldiers, and we spent so much time in prayer and worship. And so it wasn't made known to me how different I was and how unacceptable I was, until, around that time when kids started making fun of me. And it was over that summer that we left the community and we moved to a different area. So it was like a new life, a new world. So, and again, and during that time, because I'm kind of entering puberty and starting to sexually mature, I'm realizing, oh, I am what these kids are calling me. So this sequence of events of learning how horrible homosexuals are, it's the worst thing you can be, you're going to get AIDS and die a horrible death and then burn for eternity in hell. And then being told, oh, you are one of these people. And me being like, what are you talking about? And then realizing, oh, they're right. I am one of these people. And then being extracted out of that community where I felt safe and, where I knew everyone. And it was a really protected kind of sphere. And then being placed in a public school, so I went from like 4 kids in my grade, including myself, to, 200 kids or whatever. And it was a public school. It was a secular school. There was no prayer or anything like that. It was just a totally different world. And so all my ties with my old friends, my old teachers, my old mentors, the people who prayed over me, who, made me feel forgiven and loved and were kind of like the kind of representatives of God, like who, if I sinned, if I did wrong, if I earned their favor again and were in their good graces, it was almost like I was in God's good graces. So with those people not around, and then at my new school, the kids picking up on my gender nonconformity right away and saying, are you a boy or a girl? You're a faggot, this and that, and bullying me relentlessly. So that was when the dark times really started. I was not emotionally prepared to or mature enough to deal with it. I had no coping mechanism. My coping mechanism was I did start drinking alcohol alone, and with other kids in the neighborhood to deal with the anxiety and the fear. And then meanwhile as well, I developed OCD, in the form of scrupulosity, which was, ritualistic prayer and constant praying and, for forgiveness, because I was convinced that it was because I was so bad that all of this was happening, and it, became this kind of mode of attempting to control things when everything seemed so out of control.
And were you like the only one in your school coming out as gay? Because you're a bit older than me, right? You're 40?
I'm
Yeah.
40.
Yeah, okay.
I'm
So
40.
back
So
in the
this was
day.
in 90, this was in 19, hmm So this was in 1995. And so I was not out, like my response to it was the obsessive prayer, the drinking, but I also defeminized myself. So I was like a full-time job to just eradicate any sign of femininity. I became, uh, just a total chameleon. I became what I felt other people needed me to be. So I changed my music taste. I walked differently. I wore different clothes. I cut my hair. I just, I defeminized. Constantly self-scanning for signs of femininity that I needed to just expunge immediately. So that other kids would leave me alone. And it kind of worked. I, you know, was a good actor. And so by the next year, eighth grade, I kind of started to gain friends. Even the people who had bullied me the year before kind of started to want to hang out with me because I was a sweet kid. I was a nice kid. I was a funny kid, and I became what they wanted me to be. I was, a chameleon. I didn't come out until I was 17. I went to high school and, still wearing the masks, the straight acting, masks, and still drinking. And then eventually got into pot, which was really a salve because it really soothed the OCD. It helped me to sleep at night. It calmed the obsessive thoughts. That was really kind of like the first self-medicating that really worked. But so then, and it also, as I'm 16, 17, it also kind of created a buffer a little bit between the thoughts of me being gay and like the fear that I had. It softened it a little bit. So I was actually kind of able to look at my sexuality and be more honest about it because of that buffer, that kind of armor that pot gave me. It allowed me to detach from my thoughts a little bit and they were less frightening.
Yeah.
Detach from reality a little bit. So I did come out around 17.
When did like the drugs and alcohol turn to like an addiction for you? At what point in your life were you when that happened? And what was that experience like?
It was around that time. I mean, I drank from the beginning. I drank alcoholically. Like, I drank to get drunk. I drank for the effect produced by alcohol. I drank until I couldn't really control how much I drank from the beginning. But uh it was really around 16, 17 when I started smoking pot that I became very, very addicted to pot because of the way that it soothed me and calmed the anxiety and helped with my OCD, which was really debilitating in a lot of ways. And so that was when it really amped up. Then my senior year of high school, I got into heavier substances like opiates and things like that, and that was when it really took off. So by my senior year, I was a full-fledged addict that needed to be using some kind of substance every day.
And when did you find healing? Like, how long did that last?
So yeah, so it was, I graduated from high school and then I went to college for a semester. This was in the fall of 2001. And my drug use had gotten worse. The drugs were no longer working like they used to kind of soothe me or calm me, or make things better. So my depression was getting worse. My anxiety was getting worse, and I was kind of starting to lose it a little bit. I completed that semester, left college, and then a month later, I was in the psych ward because I had like a total manic episode, psychotic break. I had gone on a cocaine binge, and as a result of that, I became delusional and manic, and I was hospitalized, and I became suicidal. And so that year, 2002, I had about 4 trips to the psych ward. And that was the year that I attempted to get sober because I knew that, I couldn't put the cart before the horse. Like, I knew I had so many mental health issues to deal with and things to deal with, from my past, resolving religious issues with my sexuality, etc. But I knew that I needed to cut out the drugs and alcohol because I knew from such a young age that I wasn't doing it normally, that it was a problem. 2003 is when I finally got into a 12-step program and got sober. And that was where the recovery and the healing really started. And it was not an easy go at all. And there was, 2 steps forward, 5 steps back, kind of thing in terms of my mental health and but that was when I really started to broach the surface of coming to terms with my sexuality and what I was programmed to believe about it as a kid.
Yeah, can you tell me more about that? Like, finally accepting yourself as gay. Like, can you remember a specific moment, and then how did that turn out for you? Like, finally suppressing yourself for so long, and then just coming to a moment of like, oh, it's actually okay to be gay.
It took a really long time to feel safe and to feel okay. I think finding some other friends that were really supportive, and accepting was really helpful, where, I could talk to them about it. I did go to gay identified 12-step meetings, which was also a big game changer because it helped me connect with other sober gay men and women who, shocker, had experienced a lot of the same things that I did. I thought that I was so unique. But then, I came to find that, hey, this is like a really common experience for gays and lesbians, especially people who have had religious upbringings, and there are a lot of us. So that was really, really helpful. Um, but I'll tell you, I think it was when things really started to change, like fundamentally, like when I really started to develop a new perspective, was I met my now husband. And, it's very exciting because I fell in love, and it was a really great, and, wonderful feeling and experience. And I was 28 at the time. And meanwhile, the in my home state, the Maryland state legislature was considering the same-sex marriage legislation. And prior to that, I had no desire to get married. I was like, it's an antiquated institution, et cetera, et cetera. But when I met him, I wanted to marry this person. And so I kind of had, a hat in the ring. I got involved with the local group that was the activist group that was looking to get marriage equality passed. So that year in 2012 is when I started volunteering for that. And I was very I was not optimistic. I had a very pessimistic view. I didn't think that we were going to win that campaign. And then on election day in November of 2012, we ended up winning. And it was like a blowout for the 4 states where marriage equality was on the ballot. All 4 of those measures passed. And that was that night, watching those results come in and seeing that the majority of voters supported my right to get married, it was something just switched. And I wish I could say that like the majority opinion wasn't so vital that it didn't matter to me what other people thought, but somehow that kind of like renewed my faith in the future. And it also made me feel like, oh, maybe I'm not bad. Maybe I'm not destined for just this horrible, miserable future. Like maybe I can have a happy ending, and maybe other people think I deserve a happy ending too. In fact, it seems like the majority of people think I deserve a happy ending. And so it was a really transformative experience. I felt like I could kind of hold my head a little bit higher. It just felt like I was kind of a little bit more a part of the human race, a part of society. There's a lot of debates about that, which I came to understand later about assimilation versus, a counterculture and raising, Western institutions like, marriage and so on. But for me at the time, it was empowering, and it really lit a fire under me to get involved with more social justice and human rights issues, especially when it came to gay and lesbian people, and then eventually trans people as well. So I really that changed the trajectory of my life, because I was a hairstylist at the time, and I had been for about, I don't know, 10 years or somewhere around there, and 8 years. And then I decided, we got married in 2014, and shortly after that I decided I wanted to go back to school to be a writer, to be a journalist, and to write about human rights and LGBT rights issues. And so that was what set me on the track to go back to school and to finish my degree. And that's how I ended up at Columbia University in New York, where I got my undergraduate degree. We moved up to New York so I could do that. So I think that was where things really changed.
And also, you've spoken about, or there seems to be in our culture today, people are speaking up about a change in LGBT rights since gay marriage, right? We won gay marriage. We're accepted now. I can pull this back to my experience coming out as a lesbian. I'm 30, so this was 15 years ago now. I was 15 years old and I went to an all Christian school, and I was the only one. Like, it was fucking like so difficult. Like, people like look, yeah, I mean, I'm sure I had some very similar experiences to you in that way, and now where we're at today, it seems like we're so accepted, but then we've diverged to something else. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you can explain, that change in the LGBT rights. Like, when did it become about, it seems to be about gender now, as opposed to like loving and accepting everyone for who they are. It seems to be more ideological. I'm just wondering, like, when do you write about this a lot, so I'm keen to get into that. But when did you notice the change?
I noticed the change when I went to Columbia, because I I was on this really uber progressive liberal campus where there were gender studies, where the conversation was so different from what I was used to. And mind you, I was on board. Like, I considered myself a very progressive person. But once I kind of started to evaluate a lot of these ideas that had originated in academia when it comes to queer theory and gender studies and so forth, and the way that my not peers per se, I mean, but yeah, the other students who were, most of them a lot younger than me, were talking about sexuality and gender, I realized that we were coming from very, very different places. There was this attitude of uh, cis gays or cisgender gays were these assimilationists, kind of dinosaurs, relics of the past that, had you know, assimilated, which was a no-no, because what I didn't realize until shortly thereafter, when I started really studying gay and lesbian history and LGBT history and really getting into it, was that this wasn't a new rupture within this activist community, that this was an old fight where there were a faction of people who were very much about not having a place at the table, not being accepted into society, but saying fuck society and, you know, changing it entirely, flipping the table. And,
Who were these people?
there were a lot of really radical, queer, leftist activists who comprised maybe the majority of or a large majority of the activist base, coming out of the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And so in the 90s, the 80s and the 90s, when things kind of turned from this, sexual liberation, screw marriage, screw heteronormative society, to the initiatives were about marriage equality, about service in the military. These are Western institutions, like, very picket fence, very, pro patriotism kind of, in some eyes, in some views, initiatives. And so when that kind of became the main goal, a lot of people were really resentful and grew really resentful and felt really ignored, because they wanted they didn't want families and they wanted a total counterculture. They wanted alternative lifestyles to be just as valid as these other state approved lifestyles. So that was all had been brewing and was there. So when, gays were allowed to serve in the military and then marriage equality happened, there was a lot of people kind of waiting and saying, okay, well, now you fuckers got what you want. And now we can kind of get back to essentially kind of raising everything and rebuilding a new kind of socialist utopia, that we had always envisioned. These people, a lot of them are very utopian in their views, and there's the queer is a politics as much as it is a sexual or gender identity. A lot of people that count themselves as queer wouldn't really be gay or lesbian, back in the day. They're more just in line with radical leftists, kind of Marxist ideology about what the future should look like, especially in the West. So I think that was a big part of it. So that was where I really started to see, when I was at this Ivy League campus, that this is the way that people were talking about this. And that even though this had just happened, my views or my experience had become old fashioned already. And I needed to get on board or kind of get out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. You've just light bulb moment because I'm just like, well, without the radicals, we probably would have never got the rights. But what they're fighting for now just seems like completely overblown because in my head, I'm like, yeah, you just want to integrate us into society, right? But they're saying, no, let's tear society down and create a whole new one with, I mean, I'm just like, and maybe this is where we're splitting up now, right? People are trying to separate from the
Mm-hmm.
T, which
It is.
I don't know if that's the answer, but it's like there's this complete divide within the LGBT. I don't like to say community. I don't think we're a community. I think we're a category. Like being gay is, you have a certain life experience. But yeah, there's a huge divide, and there's people that are really political, and then there's us that just want to get on with our lives. Yeah, man, that's like where did so gender ideology and all this stuff came from those radicals, right?
Essentially, yeah. I mean, it has in some of its uh, origins or can be found in, feminism and kind of even second wave feminism, um, in a way, because there was this idea that sex differences were not biological, that there was, you know, biological essentialism was a no-no, that it was all
Yeah,
socially constructed, and that,
yeah,
you know, and so there's value to that when you think about gender and about how women and men are conditioned to behave in different ways, because there are always exceptions to the rule. There are women and men, stereotypes exist for a reason because they're real. People are in fact that way. There is a norm and there's nothing wrong with that, but there are natural variations and deviations from that, from the norm. Gays and lesbians are often an example of deviations. Gender nonconforming people, homosexuality is a form of gender nonconformity. We're nonconforming in the fact that we are same-sex attracted, and we're a minority, but we're a valid minority. So, um, there was a huge push to really focus on the idea of social construction, and any kind of essentialism was viewed as very, very backwards and no, and regressive. But that, coupled with new departments in universities, women's studies and gender studies and critical theories and queer studies, where the main objective of these was not to really create new knowledge and kind of move further towards the truth, which historically is the purpose of education and university, but to create a more egalitarian or equal. It became more about social justice than the truth. So the truth became secondary to making everything equal, and again, this utopian view where everybody's perfectly equal and everybody has. So rather than thinking about like equality of opportunity, it was all about equality of outcome. So thinking not in individualism and an personalism in this kind of thinking of people as individuals, but thinking of people in groups as their racial categories, as their ethnic categories. And it became regressive because it was putting everybody, you say like, yeah, LGBT people, we're not a community. We're just a group of people or a population. We have some things in common, but we're many and varied. But that ideology and that way of looking at things lumps us all together and says, you think the same way, you want the same things, you act the same. We clearly do not all think and want and act in the same ways and things. We have different ideas because we're all very different people. And there's a lot of things that make us different. We have different socioeconomic backgrounds. We have different theories. We have different ideas. We met different people. We just all have different lives and different paths. And, there are things that we have in common, and there are things where we really, really, really are different. So, yes, that is where, when we talk about gender ideology or gender identity ideology, it became this kind of idea that really kind of snowballed quickly of everyone has a gender identity, and gender identity supersedes biological sex. The gender identity actually determines sex. So one's natal sex, or the sex they were assigned at birth, is irrelevant and secondary to how female or male someone feels on the inside. Just this total radical, nebulous kind of made up belief. And that was what came about. But what I think people need to understand is that when we talk about gender ideology and gender identity ideology and all of these things, even transgenderism, there's no clear definition of what transgenderism is, even in the transgender community or population, if you will. So historically, it's an umbrella term, and there's a lot of disagreement over, even in the activist trans community, about who is really trans, or what comprises trans, or what transgenderism is. So what's problematic about that is that that's fine. There can be different definitions and different labels, and there can be different ways of looking at things, and let's talk about it. The problems is that, one, people are alienated and excommunicated for having positions that were fine 3 minutes ago and that will be fine 3 minutes from now. But not only that, there is in all of these institutions, especially medical institutions, there's a push to medicalize gender nonconformity and transgenderism, which is the same thing. It's an umbrella term. TGNC is transgender and gender nonconforming. So gender nonconforming people are part of the transgender, umbrella. There's this push to medicalize, which means that we've regressed so dramatically because we wanted to create a society where people can just be who they are and have society make space for gender nonconforming people. But what this ideology is saying is that these people have to change to fit into society because gender nonconforming people aren't accepted in society. So it would be fine if there was disagreement about what comprises transgenderism. But the sad thing, or the unfortunate thing is that, well, when young kids and young people are saying I'm trans, or anybody saying I'm trans, there's all of these gender clinics that have exploded and popped up everywhere. And there's people that are more than willing to say, oh, well, then here we have these hormones for you, or here we have these puberty blockers for you. And they're experimenting and giving these people drugs that don't have a big evidence base, or that they've harmed so many people already. They're doing irreversible surgeries. So that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's fine. Don't be indecision about anything. Things are changing, and we can talk about things in different ways, but that means that we should really put the brakes on medicalizing this problem. If you can't even agree, if none of us can even agree what the problem is, or even if it's in a problem to begin with.
Yeah, but you've made me think. What I don't understand is, so we've gone from not accepting gender nonconformity to accepting it and then quickly medicalizing it. Is that what you're saying?
Yes. And so, I mean, that's a huge thing. And so anybody that, I mean, even with these gender identity clinics, like if you look at with the GIDS, like Tavistock in the UK, and so like going back, a lot of these places, even Mermaids UK, these places were advocating for, with the understanding that very few of these young people, or people that are having gender identity issues, will grow up to be what was considered transsexual or want to transition. People need an accepting place where they can come talk to people and say, it's okay to be the way that you are. Let's explore it. Let's talk about it. But once the Dutch protocol was developed in Amsterdam, and then it really took off, and it became once the medicalization of it really took off, and then the social contagion element of it, and all of these things, it was a perfect storm for um for us to get where we are. So yes, we did go from, hey, let's make it more accepting for people to be whoever they are. Women can be whatever, men can be whatever, and that's fine. Let's expand the categories of man and woman, to now we're narrowing them so dramatically, because anybody who deviates from, the 50s version of a man or a woman is either non-binary or some kind of other gender or transgender, which means that they're making the categories of men and women, minuscule.
Yeah, right. But what I don't understand, Ben, is it's because it seems like gender nonconformity in women has always been more acceptable than gender nonconformity in men, right? Like if you're a masculine chick, like it's kind of, it's okay. But if you're a feminine dude, it's like, whew, no. But it seems to be the girls that are, taking on new pronouns or transitioning. Do you have any understanding around that?
So that's a good point, and it's true, and you're right, and that's kind of even universal across cultures, that women are more, I don't want to say accepted, but they have a less of a hard time if they're more gender nonconforming, like more butch or masculine, than men do who are more feminine. That's kind of can be attributed a lot to kind of the sexism and misogyny that kind of underlies different cultures and societies, where it's acceptable for a woman to act like a boy or behave like a man, because to be a man is acceptable and okay, but it's unacceptable for a man to behave or look or act like a woman, because then he's degrading himself, right? So he's like lowering himself to so there's a lot of sexism and misogyny there. um that's one thing. So yes, historically, the people that would go to gender identity clinics and would seek some kind of transition were males, were natal males. That demographic flipped entirely, and now the majority are young women who are going. The majority of them are same-sex attracted, but a lot of them aren't. This has a lot to do with social contagion. Young women demographically are, and historically are, very, very vulnerable to social contagion, especially when it comes to body related issues, to mental health related issues, whether it's eating disorders or suicide, etc. Young women are really, really vulnerable to that historically. That's just how it's always been. And so that cohort that's showing up in clinics now, the large majority of them being adolescent teen women, girls, and less boys now, that's why, is because of what some people call rapid onset gender dysphoria, but it's also, so I mean, you see this in groups of young girls and young women coming out as trans and non-binary and so forth. And so it's a really kind of trendy thing. I mean, even when gay and lesbian and bisexual acceptance really kind of took off, I do remember in the 2010s and so forth, when I was a hairstylist at the time, my clients telling me that everybody in their kids' school now was identifying as bi, like all the girls were bi or lesbian or stuff like that, because it became kind of this thing. And it's like, well, but with transgenderism, it's different, because you're medicalizing. These young women are looking at YouTube and they're looking on TikTok and they're seeing these videos of people with post-top surgery and having their breasts cut off, and they're saying, I'm so happy, and they're like, I want to be just like them. And of course, young women too, they don't want to be sexualized, and they don't want to be, so there's a desire to keep themselves in this androgynous state, and it's very multifaceted, but there are explanations for why it's mostly young women now.
I just want to try and be a bit objective here, because I think it can be easy to get ourselves put ourselves in these echo chambers. And I hear these arguments from conservatives all the time, like it's a contagion, it's young girls, and perhaps I'm in the arts and I don't want to get cancelled, but I am seeing it in, I guess, maybe what's the issue with, no, I'm hearing myself when I'm asking that, like, what's the issue with all these young girls changing their bodies? It's like, ugh. But I mean, there's statistics out there that suggests that only few people regret their transition. So I'm just like, I get the concern is like, oh my God, what if it's a mistake? But I don't know. I just want to, like, is it like, are we being objective here?
That's a good point. And you're right. I mean, I have friends and I know adults who have transitioned and are happy that they transitioned, that are happy with their transition. Those same adults that I'm friends with, that are transgender people, that have transitioned, that have gotten top surgeries and are on hormones and have transitioned, they are in the same camp. And they say social contagion is real. Child transition should not be happening. Teen transition should not be happening. I made this decision when I was an adult. It in no way, shape, or form are young people capable of making these decisions, especially when it comes to sterility and sexual function and fertility and so forth. There is absolutely, I mean, contagion is a loaded word, but there's a contagion element to it because social media is such a huge influence in people's lives. Kids spend hours and hours and hours and hours on their cell phone, and on their computers, and they're kind of fashioning their identities based upon what they're viewing online rather than kind of really developing identities based on real world life experiences. So they're kind of really pressured too into determining what they are from a really young age. When they're in school and they're in middle school and they're learning about gender identity and all these different labels, they're kind of like, even some of them are late bloomers and they haven't really figured this out yet, but they're kind of like being told that they need to have a label. So they're like, oh, I'm a demi boy, or, oh, I'm queer, I'm bisexual, like they're not there yet. It takes people a while to really figure out, who they are, who they're going to be. And so it's not a conservative opinion. There are conservatives that have and that have really taken over the conversation. There are right-wing people who have really exploited this issue because those are the news outlets and the people that get a lot of attention. They rile people up with this. And the left has a lot of catching up to do. People on the left say the course correction has to come from the left because there are myriad leftists and people on the left and people, really liberal people, who have these views about the ideas about social contagion and about how, yes, there are people who will grow up to transition, but there are a lot of people who won't, and we're doing a lot of harm. You mentioned studies that show that, there's a low rates of regret. Well, these studies have a lot of bias. Some of them are based on surveys that were taken only within maybe 1 or 3 years of transition, when we know historically that regret often occurs maybe 7, 8, 9, 10 years after transition. So the other thing is that people who detransition, they don't report their detransitions to their gender clinic. They don't go back and say, hey, guess what? I'm no longer doing this or taking the hormones. They just detransition. So the doctors and clinicians erroneously suspect that, oh, that means that that all these people that I help transition are still transition. No, it doesn't mean that at all. People that detransition don't always go back and tell their doctors that they had done the wrong thing. In fact, the survey of like 100 detransitioners, about a quarter of them, 25 of them, didn't return to their doctors to say, hey, I detransitioned. This was the wrong path for me. So there's a lot of bias and a lot of really bad evidence supporting the really low detransition rates, or the really, there's just a lot of shoddy evidence out there. And that's the unfortunate thing because, again, trans people are real. Gender dysphoria is real. There are going to be people that do transition. and they need to be fully equipped with all of the information about what transition entails and whether it's really, really right for them. And that this idea of informed consent just isn't occurring.
Yeah, I suppose I'm interested in like it seems like you just want to make sure that people are making the right decision. That's what I'm hearing from you. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Okay. So
I want to
yeah.
make sure people are making the right decision. And you know, what's really important to me too is that I want to make sure that we're not medicalizing gay and lesbian kids who would grow up to be gay and lesbian, because we all know that gender nonconformity is a very clear indicator of homosexuality in adulthood. So if young kids who are experiencing or saying that they are dysphoric or they don't feel normal or they feel, you know, have some kind of internalized homophobia, if trans is like the thing and, you know, they're given these ideas that they might have been born in the wrong body and that this can be a solution that can be fixed with the help of doctors, that there's nothing that they've done wrong, that they can just be engineered to be in the right body, then that is a huge concern. And that's not just a concern for me, that's a legitimate concern that clinicians who work in and have worked in these clinics have said, that we're concerned that we're medicalizing gay and lesbian people and that we are performing a new type of conversion therapy and kind of turning these gay kids into straight kids. But you don't want to talk about gay kids and lesbian kids, because then that's kind of sexualizing kids or kind of putting, again, the cart before the horse. In this way, gender always precedes sexuality. And that means that when it becomes all about gender to begin with, we're not thinking about, you know, sexual maturity and what the kid's going to be like once they go through or after they go through puberty. If we're halting their puberty and not allowing them to go through it and resolve their gender dysphoria, which historically most kids who have what was called gender identity disorder in the past, when they did go through puberty, their dysphoria would resolve, and about 80%, 60 to 90% of kids would end up desisting and not have dysphoria anymore. And the majority of them would grow up to be gay or lesbian. So that's what the evidence tells us. So if we're halting all these kids' puberty, yes, some of those kids might grow up or would have grown up to still identify as transgender and want to medically transition and try to attempt to live and be seen and perceived as the opposite sex. But there's a large majority of those kids who would grow up to be gay, lesbian, just like you and me.
Yeah, it's just they're in a different time or culture almost. Like I kind of wonder what would happen.
Right.
What would happen to me if I was growing up today? I guess that kind of, what am I trying to say here? Yeah, there's gender dysphoria and then there's just not fitting the feminine box. That's what I'm noticing. Like as a woman, you know, my whole life I was told I was like a dude. Right? Like, oh, you're manly. Like, oh, you're not. You know, you're like a beast, or you're this, you're that. You should wear a dress. All this stuff. Like that feels like it's like social kind of stuff. Like I've never felt uncomfortable with my body. Actually, that's not true. Most people feel uncomfortable with their body in one form or another, or don't like certain parts of their body. And I even remember trying on the pronouns. It would have been like 5 years ago. I was like, I'm gender non-conforming. All these people around me were like, the concept was gender fluidity, right? It was like, oh yeah, we're non-conforming and these are our pronouns. But I guess I just, I don't know. I don't want to go around telling people to use pronouns and then the type of people that are using it today, it seems to be about like control and I don't know. It's like, why not just be gender non-conforming and embrace who you are rather than going around announcing your pronouns. But also some of the loveliest people I know use pronouns, so I don't know. I don't want to get fucking cancelled for saying this, but it's, yeah. I guess what I'm trying to say is, how do we offer up? Yeah, go.
No, I want to hear what what was your question? How do we what?
how do we offer up an alternative? You wrote something in your Spiked article titled Homophobia in Drag, and you said, I want to help create a world in which feminine boys and butch girls could exist peacefully in society. A world in which gender non-conforming people were accepted as a natural variation of their own sex. How do we... I think that's a great idea, and I almost feel like we got there and then we've gone somewhere else. So I don't know how to...
We were headed there.
What happened?
We were headed there, and that is why so many lesbian and gay people and feminists are very agitated by the direction that a lot of things have gone. People that are famously labeled TERFs and people that are labeled gender critical and all like LGBT Alliance and these groups that are coming up. That is why there's a lot of frustration, is because we were like, hey, this isn't what we had in mind when we embarked on this. It wasn't to medicalize, it was to create space in society for people to be different. And so that view, which is to me a progressive view, is now seen as, as bigoted. And so how do we do that? Well, the truth about the reality of medical transition, about the experimental nature of it, about the difficulties that people who medically transition face, about all of it needs to come out for the betterment, not just of gender nonconforming people and gay and lesbian people, but for trans people as well, because people who decide to medically transition in adulthood deserve informed consent and the best type of care as well. They need to be fully informed about what these hormones and these drugs and these surgeries, what their life is going to be like after they take these and what it entails. So it's really about improving evidence-based medicine, and it's about not stifling the truth. The sad thing is that when the truth becomes like a right-wing talking point or a right-wing dog whistle, then you're in big trouble. And that's where we are now. Any kind of dissent, you're painted as some kind of bigot, or you're aligned with the right, when it couldn't be more wrong. People are just, nobody wants to be painted as a bigot. Nobody wants to be painted as unaccepting of trans people or anything like that. But to say, I think this has kind of gone off the rails here, and it's not just me. I'm getting that information from clinicians, from Dr. Laura Edwards-Leeper, who brought the Dutch protocol to the US in 2007, from Dr. Erica Anderson, who's a transgender clinical psychologist and the former president of USPATH, saying this has gone off the rails, that there's, that's all. That when you say, hey, I don't know if there's really a lot of legitimacy to feeding kids puberty blockers who are gender nonconforming and stunting their development, when puberty might be the remedy that they need to get comfortable with their bodies, that shouldn't be a controversial view. It's not a controversial view. And in 5, 10 years, 15 years, we will look back and we will recognize this for in a lot of ways, the medical scandal that it is. And so the politicization of it, of making it a left versus right thing, has probably wreaked the most havoc more than anything else, more than nefarious clinicians, because I don't even think a lot of the clinicians are nefarious in their purposes, or even drug companies who are looking for profit. That is a part of it. But I think that more than anything, it's the politicization and of the labeling of certain contentions or dissent about it as either right wing or left wing. I think that that is probably hurting more people more than anything else.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean it seems reasonable what you're saying, to just say have the two have the two things amplified. Like, yeah, what's right for you, medical transition or accepting yourself as gender nonconforming. But people don't see it that way. It's like, because if you say, what if you're just gender nonconforming, it inadvertently suggests that being trans is a bad thing, which it's not.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just like, yeah, I don't know, man. I'm ready to get canceled.
It's not a bad thing at all. It's not about, yeah. Well, it's not a bad thing at all. Being trans isn't a bad thing at all. But when, again, going back to like what transgenderism is, there are a lot of trans people that don't think that one should have to medicalize ever. So it's not about, oh, you can say you're trans or be trans, or maybe I'm trans or who's trans. In so many ways and forms, I fit the trans bill in terms of how I feel internally, or what my inner, what my own gender journey has been. I mean, it's been a ride, and so much of what gender is, especially in my experience, is performative. There's validity to the performing gender. Like I told you before, I really adapted and defeminized myself to survive and to ward off and thwart, bullies and taunting and all of that, and all of the torment. But when it comes to, well, if a kid says he's trans and right away the response is, oh, what are your new pronouns and what's your new name? Oh, and so you were born in the wrong body. Oh, so you're a girl. You're really, and completely ignoring biological reality and feeding a literal delusion and kind of nurturing that is setting people up on a pathway to experimental medicalization that might not be right for them. And so that's what the issue is. It's like, there's nothing wrong with being trans. It's what happens after one declares a trans identity often. That the response to it is what is debatable.
Okay. All right. Well, I'm going to have to get some transgender people on and have a conversation with them. If you're listening, and I'm shaking in my boots right now. Nah, yeah. I was just like, if you're out there, don't worry, I'll get a transgender person on next. Actually, I have. So, no. Hey, we're nearly in an hour, but Ben, where can what can people expect from your book, your forthcoming book, Cis White Gay? Pretty much everything we've talked about.
Yeah. So this. Pretty much everything we talked about. I mean, it's really, the subtitle is The Making of the Gender Heretic. And really what I'm doing is, a lot of it is memoir, because I'm just telling my story about my growing up gender nonconforming and about growing up gay and religious fundamentalism and all of that. And really kind of just telling the story about how I came to come to the perspective that I have, which is demonized and seen as wrongheaded. But it's like, well, this is why I came to think this way. And, once you know my story and hear my story, if you still say, oh, you're a horrible, horrible person, then fine. But at least you know why I've come to think the way that I do. So it's about that. And it's about academia. It's about queer theories kind of takeover of LGBT activism. And it's about those rifts in the activist community, like we spoke about, my experience in education and academia, and stuff like that. So that's what you can expect. But it's a lot about how this is a new iteration of anti-gay, where there are a lot of gay and lesbian people, I think, really being harmed by this. and that shouldn't be a crime to bring that up, that it's actually the progressive and kind of human rights oriented, mindful thing to say there's this minority of people that are being discriminated against and also harmed medically, and that people should care about that.
Cool, man. And where can people find you?
So they can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Ben Appel. So I'm on there. And then I have a website, benappelwrites.com, where you can kind of just see some more of my writing. But that can be linked through my Twitter or my X profile. So Ben Appel is probably the best place to find me. And then my book is going to be out next year, Cis White Gay, The Making of a Gender Heretic. I'm editing it now. And hopefully it'll be finished soon. So you'll see, I'll obviously post right away when I know the publication date for it.
Cool, man. And I'll put all those links in the show notes if people want to follow you. Otherwise, thanks so much. It's been great.
Thank you so much, Melody. I appreciate it.